you were asking before, like, what is something that is sort of, we talk about, like, during, say, an intro course in anthropology. And I mean, and I was saying that one of the really, I think, overriding, interesting topics today, and for young people particularly who are living in today's world and are trying to negotiate it, and they're in their sort of late teen years and going into their 20s, it has to do with identity and sort of identity formation and what that is and how that works. And I mean, something I've talked about in previous lectures, I've made this sort of assertion that sort of anthropological theory is practice. In other words, that, anthropology is really good to live by. And, young people who are 13, 14 years old and maybe up to even early 30s, I mean, it's a period of intense identity formation. It's a period of great intrapersonal exploration. It's a period when us human beings are maybe asking more than any other period of our life cycle, who am I? Who do I want to be? How do I become that? All these sorts of identity questions. And young people are living those sets of questions. Those are big questions too, in their everyday life. Every time from when they wake up in the morning and they decide what clothes to wear that day, to how they express themselves on their own social media channels, to the photographs they take, to the types of food they eat. I mean, sort of almost all sorts of everyday practice is often in one way or another connected to identity formation and identity processes. And this whole question of identity is something that is also very much central to the whole anthropological project. I mean, anthropologists have been trying to understand how identity and identity processes work, particularly from, not so much from an individual basis, but more from the collective basis. I mean, one of the big differences between anthropology and psychology is that, psychology is asking lots of questions about the self and the person, the individual, whereas anthropology is really thinking about processes associated with what happens when many, many individuals come together in a particular space and live together. And that's a little bit different from psychology, but these sorts of identity processes also take place not only at the level of the individual, who am I, but at the level of the community, at the level of the collectivity. And when we talk about identity and anthropology, we're often talking about group identity. Like, who am I in relation to others? And we all have so many different aspects of our identity in that respect, in terms of our group identity. I mean, we are, for example, we all carry certain passports. So we will identify ourselves by our nationality, for example. We may identify our group identity through the language we speak, or perhaps through the color of our skin, or through our ethnicities, or we may identify collectively in terms of our gender or our sex or our sexuality. We may identify to groups based on the types of work we do, our profession. And this is what makes us a person. And one of the things that anthropology does and has been doing very well is trying to explore the dynamics of group identity processes. So like, how are nations constituted? What makes people feel a part of a nation, for example, or part of a race, or part of an ethnic group, or part of a gender? I mean, this is really a lot of stuff that's at the heart of our discipline and at the heart of the big questions that we're often asking. And, you're asking a question about what are the challenges today when it comes to identity maybe in people's everyday lives. And I think that, that's a very good question. And I mean, I would like to sort of begin to try to address that question by sort of pointing out an observation. And I think I'm not the only one who's made this observation, but I was also once a teenager, and I was also once a university student and a school student. And when I sort of spend a lot of time like I do with young people, and I've always spent time with young people, my whole life I've been working with young people, I see often that young people today are dealing with different challenges than I dealt with, for example. And I also see that young people are suffering from different pressures than, for example, me and my friends suffered from when I was at university. And I think we also know that, for example, mental unwell-being is much more prolific today among young people than it used to be. And when I say used to, I think 30 years ago. There's much more anxiety, there's much more perfectionism, there's much more depression, there's much more suicide, there's much more uncertainty. And this is a sort of public health sort of fact that has evolved over the past 30 years, let's say, at least the time frame that I have experienced myself. And so you're asking, what are some of these challenges around identity and identity formation that people are facing today? And I think that those challenges around identity today are partly maybe at the root of some of these other pressures and sort of unwell beings that we see among young people today that didn't seem to exist as much when I was younger. And I think it could be partly a source of that unwell being. And I guess, one of the things, and I want to explain that a little bit further, because I guess one of the things that anthropology really makes very clear about identity and identity formation processes is that identity is like a two-sided coin. And identity is not simply what I, as an individual person, declare to the world is my identity. That's only part of it. And I think what the other part of it that is just as important to identity and identity processes, and it's a part of it that often goes unnoticed or is not talked about as much, has to do with how other people perceive us. So, for example, you may be a person from a particular country, let's say. Let's say you are German and you carry a German passport, but actually you never even grew up in Germany and you went to international schools your whole life and your German is not very good, but your parents have told you your whole life you're German and you carry a German passport. So when someone asks where you're from, you say, oh, I'm German. But then one day you find yourself living in Germany and you go to the market there and you start ordering some food and people hear that your German sounds sort of not native, you make a lot of mistakes, and they ask you where you're from and you say, no, I'm German. And the people might say, you're not German. Come on, you can't be from Germany. You're not German. You don't seem German. And you say, no, I am German. And I think that example, for example, is really showing the two-sided aspects of identity. On the one side is who you or who I think and feel I am and want the world to see me as. And on the other side is how most of the world actually does see me. And I think in today's age, we see this actually most specifically in very contested debates around gender. and gender identity and gender identities. In the last, say, 15 years, we have really seen an absolute fracturing of what was, for the most part, a sort of binary conception of gender. So when I grew up, I mean, there were men and women for the most part. And there were some other categories in our Western societies, like transvestite, someone who dressed in the opposite gender's style. But in the last 15 years or so, we have seen an explosion of possible gender identities. No longer only two possibilities, but now many different possibilities. And as a result of all that gender space opening up, of course, lots of people start filling those spaces, and people express themselves and identify themselves as, for example, transgender or non-binary, or gender fluid, or any other number of possibilities. And then those people live in the world, of course, and they live in society, and they assert themselves and their identity as they see and feel themselves. But often, on the other side, people do not see and treat them in ways that align with their own expressions of who they are. And for me, that is something I sort of think about as a sort of form of identity dissonance. In other words, when people from the outside see you and treat you in another identity frame than you yourself see yourself. And I think this is a great source of anxiety and challenge for people who aren't fitting the dominant normative frames of identity in the world. And I think these types of challenges around identity are partly at the root of what I see young people trying to negotiate during these times. And I think that anthropology's understanding of identity processes as not simply something that originates in and stays within the individual person, but as something that also has another side to it, a collective side to it. I think that recognition is really important, both for public discussions around new forms of identity in society, and also for individuals who are themselves trying to negotiate and develop their own identities in relation to the bigger world around them. It's a really interesting question. I think like one of the things that changed is greater possibilities, greater number of possibilities. As I listen to you talk, I'm thinking about the cereal aisle in the supermarket. I mean, like 30, 40 years ago when I was a kid and I went shopping with my mother, and we went down the cereal aisle, there were like 10, 12 different cereal boxes one could choose from. And of course, one didn't need to spend that much time to choose, standing there thinking about, ooh, what cereal do I want? Because there were like, 12, and most of them you didn't like, and then there were the sweet ones, and there were like 4 that were really unhealthy, and then it was just like a choice between 4. And now, of course, when we go down the cereal aisle in a supermarket in a big city, there are maybe 100 different or 150 different possibilities, and then you're stuck staring there at all that cereal, and you're thinking, maybe I want this one, maybe I want that one. It's like, and I think identity has become a little bit like the cereal aisle. In that respect, that like when you grow up and you're young and it's like, well, who am I? Well, when I was young, it was like, well, like what nationality am I? Okay, I'm American because that's who I was, and it was the Cold War, and I'm definitely not Soviets. I mean, that's the enemy, right? In the Cold War era, there were like 2 choices to almost everything. Like you're either supporting the Americans or you're supporting the Soviets. It's like an easy question. It doesn't take that long. You're either like a communist or you're a Democrat, or you are in favor of capitalism or you're in favor of socialism, or so in the binary world of the post-war era, the choice was much less. And with almost everything. And today the choice, like, there's so many ideologies and political ideologies and gender identities, and now because people are moving so much more through global spaces, like people are being raised by parents who come from two different parts of the world and they have 2 or 3 different passports, and there's so much more choice and possibility of who am I, and therefore there's much more to explore and much more to think about, and it becomes, I think, more complicated and more stressful to try to find oneself in a cereal aisle packed with 150 different types of cereals than it is in a cereal aisle that has only 10. I would think more space. There's more bandwidth, because people are not having to busy themselves with, like, I just got to earn an income now, and I just got to get food on the table, or I have to just survive because there's a war going on around me. I mean, there's more space. Is that freedom, maybe? There's more, I mean, of course, time is the same amount of time in a day that there's always been, right? I mean, so I'm not so sure if it's time or space, but indeed, I mean, there are more possibilities. Again, I think that the possibilities for one's existence, at least in this part of the world, has expanded greatly. And I think there are other things, though, that go into it. Like, for example, like neoliberalism, for example, which is, this sort of current that really begins in the early 1980s with the rise of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, this shift from a post-war sort of welfare era to a sort of neoliberal orientation or political and economic ideology that becomes more and more prominent over time. And, following the Second World War, there was a great deal of attention paid on society because, Europe was in ruins and had to be rebuilt. The economy was a disaster. People were poor, and, there was a great deal of attention paid to building the society. And people were thinking a lot more about society. And I think in the early 1980s, this starts shifting. And the welfare state that gets built following the Second World War starts getting called into question. Is this actually a source of, like, an obstacle to our progress as a society and as a species? All of this question and focus on society. If we sort of delink individuals from society, might they be able to prosper? Might we be able to prosper more? And so since, like, the 1980s, like, we of course have seen this neoliberal orientation gaining more and more strength all around the world and becoming more and more dominant. And what's really central to neoliberalism is an emphasis, a dominant emphasis on the individual over society, over the collective. And that has also forced people to start thinking more about themselves in many different ways, because it's a disposition that is emanating in and through society that is asking us to continually think about ourselves de-anchored from other people. And that's a different sort of disposition than was sort of spreading through European and American society following the Second World War. Back then, it was like forcing people to ask and think of themselves as being connected to other people, to their community, to their neighborhood, to their country. And now, the gist of ideas and policies and public discourse and free market economies is to orientate us towards ourselves. And I think that also raises a lot of challenges for everybody, and especially for younger people who are going through a particular stage in their life where trying to understand who we are is maybe more prominent. And are we individuals, or am I a person that belongs together with other people? And if so, which other people? And it's, and one of the sort of sad things I find about this process is that we're easily able to think about who we are as individuals today and what makes us unique as individuals, because we're constantly seeking that uniqueness. And what we find more and more difficult is to try to understand why we're all, as individuals, really ordinary. And this past semester, actually, in my intro course, when I asked the students to introduce themselves, I asked them to say, a little bit about themselves, and people, volunteered things about themselves that made them unique. Oh, I'm actually only 16 years old. Oh, wow, you're studying at university and you're 16 years old? That's pretty unique. And, people would really be able to express to one another what makes them quite a special person. And then I had this thought, I was like, let's do another round, and I'd like you to all tell me what's ordinary about yourself. What makes you an ordinary person? And a lot of the students just could not answer that question. They had to really think about it. What makes me ordinary? And in a world where people are mostly thinking about what makes me unique, and I've talked before about like the importance of keeping spaces open to ask big questions, and big questions from lots of different angles, so to speak, and different perspectives. But if you're only asking questions about what makes me unique, what's also happening is you're not asking questions about what makes me ordinary, what makes me common, what makes me like everybody else. What do we share as people, as opposed to what makes me different from everybody? So seems to be this really tendency towards trying to define ourselves by our difference from others, at the expense of trying to define ourselves as actually very similar to others. And I think that causes a lot of disagreements in society, and conflict and friction. And yeah, there are things that make us different, but there are also many, many things that make us similar. And it seems to me that if we spend more time focusing on what makes us similar than what makes us different, we can live together more harmoniously and more pleasantly. We can enjoy one another much more. And I think that's one of the casualties of late neoliberalism. I've talked about it before in lectures and stuff. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is that, I find that young people today are really struggling with this question, this tension in themselves between me, as I call it, like who am I as a person, as maybe a unique person, as a extraordinary person, who am I, me, on the one hand, and then they're struggling at the same time with this absence or this difficulty in finding the us in our life. Because as people try to continually define their uniqueness as individuals, they're at the same time limiting their own possibilities for connecting with others. In other words, for finding an us. And I think human beings as a species, one of our great attributes, one of our great ingredients for the success of our species over other species on Earth, is that we are incredibly social animals. Like, we have been able to achieve as a species all that we've achieved because we are social. We work together. We are a collectivity. We achieve more together than we can achieve individually. And when we're focusing so much on what makes us unique and individual, we are sort of unable to fulfill perhaps that evolutionary component of ourselves, that we need to be social. We need to belong to a group. We need to be with other people in order to be human. And that's that great expression from Southern Africa, like, you can only be human together, right? And as young people are maybe so forced to think about their individuality, they're suffering from a lack of opportunity to be human together. And I think that that's a tension that's also, and it's an identity like dynamic process that is also creating a lot of challenges for individuals and for young people in general. And so I think that this challenge, I framed it as a me versus us tug of war, so to speak, that seems to be taking place in young people. And the me is winning out because there are so many forces like our telephones, like our individual algorithms that are feeding us information that is unique to me and my interests, that is constantly pushing us towards this me side of the, there's also neoliberalism and free market economy and government policies that are all pushing. There's this great force that's pushing us towards the me side of that continuum. But actually people also need and want this us element. And I think that that's creating challenges for people in society. And it looks a little bit different, I think, for people from my generation, because like I was saying, during the Cold War, in particular, it was a simpler world, it was a binary world. Like, we didn't have a problem finding an us because, when I was young, like young people, when they were trying to define themselves, we weren't trying to define ourselves as unique. We were trying to belong. We wanted to be like the rest of the crowd. Everyone wanted to just fit in. We wanted to be part of the crowd. We wanted to be part of the us. And so, this peer pressure was all about fitting in and being ordinary, being like everybody else. And that seems to me very different now, but it was a lot easier. And so the sort of struggles that I think came into my generation and into the generation of people who, many of whom are leading the world today, Trump's generation and so forth, is like a framing of the world around an us and a them. It's like there's the us group and there's that other group out there, right? And in my case, it was like, there's the Americans. As a young person growing up in the 1970s in the United States, there's the Americans, and then there's of course the Soviets. Like, there's an us, and I know I'm an American. That's my us group, and then there's a them group, and that's the Soviets. And it was like that for almost everything. I mean, when I was at university, there were gay people and there were straight people. Okay, there were some bi people as well, but generally you were either gay or straight, and it was like you knew which group. There was an us and a them. It was like really clear. There were men and there were women, and there weren't like transgender discourses around and possibilities. Of course there were people who didn't feel that they fit into either category, but it wasn't like a possibility. It wasn't like a cereal box on the cereal aisle yet. And so people had much clearer choices. It was an us or a them choice. And I think young people are really finished with that. I mean, the young people I see in my classroom, there's no them anymore. Like, it's just all of us young people, and we're different. And I don't see young people having the same sort of struggles with otherness, with a them that, for example, my generation had. I don't think it exists. It's just like, we're all students here. We come from lots of different countries. We speak different religions. We have different skin colors. We eat different foods. But we really like each other, and we learn together, and we learn from each other, and there aren't really any problems between us and them. The problems that I see in young people today are problems that result from a struggle that young people are having with defining themselves as individuals in relation to perhaps the pressure that we humans have built into us to be also part of a group. And those are two countervailing forces, because if you're trying to always be different, then you're at the same time also not trying to be part of a group. And I think that's challenging, very challenging. I see it more like a scale, I mean, and the scale is tilting. And it's not like there's no people anymore, young people who are busy thinking about us and them. But I'm just saying the preponderance of force seems to be going to the, me-us side for young people. And for older people, it seems to still be, because we've been brought up in that age, that's the frame that was sort of we adopted as an us-them. And that's also why I see, for example, when I, there's all that famous engagement, discussion between, say, Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg, right? That is really striking, when Donald Trump is, totally framing everything in his vision of the world around an us versus them. And he's shouting at Greta and saying, when you get your sort of PhD, come back and talk to me. But Greta is not talking, in my opinion, about us and them. She's busy talking about me and us. She's trying to figure out how individual people can also coexist with the broader us. And I think in her case, the broader us is us humans. Like, we all live on this planet. There is no them on this planet because we are all dependent on nature and on climate and on the environment, and we all are in the same boat. We're really all in the same boat for Greta. There are no two boats. There's no us boat and them boat. It's like our boat. This is us, planet Earth, human beings. And she's talking about how individuals can live within the frame of a singular us. And I think Donald Trump and those other people who are discounting people like Greta Thunberg are approaching the world like there are, one or two or three different boats of us's and them's, and it's a competition. And I think they're speaking different languages, and I think that's part of the problems we're having, that the people that are still running the world are running it from a very different frame of reference than the young people who are going to inherit it. So it leads to, I think, a lot of misunderstandings and bad communication and tension and conflict in society.